Miriam, it's great to be here. Really excited to have this conversation. There's obviously a lot going on in the news this week. So where education policy falls amid all that, not really sure anymore. But we're going to talk about the Obama administration's legacy. We're going to talk about what the Trump administration is behind. So I'd love to introduce Rick Hess. He is the Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. So here you have your right. And on the left, we have Carmel Martin, who's a member of the Center for American Progress's executive team. And she's a former senior advisor to Arne Duncan, Education Secretary Arne Duncan. So yeah, let's get started. I guess I'd love to hear from the two of you, just sort of high level, how would you categorize the Obama administration brief, I guess, and from the Trump administration, what have you seen that's different? Rick, do you want to start?
Sure. I think I would boil down the legacy of the Obama administration probably to 2 points, one regarding process, one policy. I think the Obama team was staffed by really smart people who meant well, like my friend Carmel. But I think on process, I think the big problem was as an administration, they had relatively little interest in what the federal government does well, what's appropriate for the federal government in our system, how federal actions play out. And along the way, they took a lot of really good and sensible ideas that we got to get better at evaluating teachers, that states should raise standards, that schools that are struggling should be improved, and they managed to make them federal policies, federal initiatives, which felt like, like they were raining down from Washington onto schools and states, and which wound up marking these as democratic, liberal ideas in such a way that now governors and legislators in 2/3 of the states look unfavorably upon stuff that they were much more comfortable with 8 years ago. So I think in terms of process, they have managed to create partisan divides that did not once exist and create tensions that were not necessary. In terms of policy, I think the problem is the Obama team wanted to do really sensible things. Again, absolutely right that we should evaluate teachers better. Absolutely right that we should figure out how to intervene in schools that are struggling. The problem is school improvement grants wound up settling upon a handful of arbitrary models for which we spent $7 billion, which were implemented crudely and in dunderheaded ways, and which wound up poisoning the brand of school turnarounds. Teacher evaluation efforts, which made sense intuitively, wound up being done haphazardly and poorly on accelerated timelines by states, and we don't even go into the Common Core. So for me, it's not about that the intent wasn't good. It's not that the ideas didn't make sense, but there was, for my mind, real problems in how the Obama administration approaches. The Trump folks, I don't know what the hell they're doing. Other than offering occasional clumsy sound bites to school choice, pretty much the Department of Education has kind of been, in neutral for the last 4 months. And I don't see any particular signs that that's going to change anytime in the near future.
So, Carmel, I'm guessing at least on the Obama administration's legacy, you feel differently. So, high-level thoughts about that.
I guess I would say I think the Obama administration's legacy is, surprise, surprise, great in the education sector. And I've always looked at these things from early childhood through post-secondary. So just to speak to that for a moment, I think there's pretty radical changes in the early childhood sector that were driven by Obama administration policies. First and foremost, an expansion of access, but also I think the entire sector is thinking, in many states, not all states, the sector is thinking very differently about how it operates. There's a lot of connections that exist today between the child care system, the preschool system, the Head Start system that didn't exist before President Obama was president. I think you see many states, dozens of states, with systems for measuring whether programs are good programs or bad programs through quality rating systems that didn't exist. They existed in some places prior to the Obama administration, but now you see most states embracing that concept that we need to give consumers parents information about those programs, about whether they're good or bad, and what kind of attributes they have. So I think that's a tremendous legacy for President Obama that's not going to get undone, I don't think, in any short-term lens. In the K-12 context, I think, first and foremost, the legacy of what didn't happen because of Barack Obama. We need to remind ourselves that when he came into power, the country was collapsing financially, which was threatening a collapse of our K-12 education system, because we were faced with the prospect of tens of thousands of teachers being fired, states thinking about shortening school weeks. I think for the children who were in the system at that time, there's a tremendous legacy, because the education system didn't collapse and it moved forward, and they got a better education as a result. In terms of the reforms that President Obama and Arnie championed around standards, data systems, which you all, I'm sure, care very much about, school turnaround, and teacher evaluation, there was a lot of political backlash to those reforms. There has been a pivot in many places, including the national level, with respect to them. But at the end of the day, we have 40-plus states that are implementing college and career-ready standards, whether they call it Common Core or not. They're doing it, and I think we're going to see over time that we're going to get better performance from our schools because of it, because schools are aligning what they're doing against the ultimate, I think, goal that we all share, that when students graduate from high school, they're ready, better prepared for college and career. And there might be some hiccups in that regard. Not every state's implementing the new higher standards perfectly, but generally speaking, I think it's a very positive thing that the systems across the country are moving in that direction. Teacher evaluation, we called for tying it to student test scores. That was extremely controversial. In a lot of places, that's being undone. But what people forget is the non-controversial parts of President Obama and Arnie's policies, which is that teacher evaluation systems need to be taken much more seriously. They need to be used as tools for improving practice. They need to be used in consideration for things like tenure decisions and advancement decisions. And so I think you see all across the country, states and districts and schools handling not just the teacher evaluation system, but the system of support of teachers very differently than they were prior to the Obama administration, which, was due to the great work of many state and local and school leaders, not to the U.S. Department of Education, but that was a shift that was inspired by the president's policies. And then I would also point out in the higher ed context, I think the big dramatic shift is a lens towards access. The federal role is not just one of access, it's also one related to quality and completion, defining success as completion, not just getting to college. And I think there's big ramifications of that shift all across the country that I don't think are going to get undone overnight. I think in terms of the new administration's likely legacy or approach is obviously you couldn't have more of a 180-degree turn than we've had. It seems like their goal is to move federal resources to the private sector, which I think is going to be extremely damaging to the education sector in America. I think, unfortunately, they have already done quite a bit of damage. They're particularly on the higher education context. They're reversing policies that were about protecting students from proprietary for-profit institutions. Their budget that was leaked yesterday shows that they want to make dramatic cuts to the personnel of the Department of Education, including the Office of Civil Rights, which will obviously have ramifications for the protection of students in terms of their civil rights. But then just kind of with great bombast, they're proposing to increase funding for student loan servicers, where there's really no justification for that except they want to line the pockets of private sector loan servicers. So, and you see that at the K-12 level as well, where they want to redirect money from public schools to private schools. So it seems like for Secretary DeVos, her guiding principle is how do I get more money into the private sector, and I think that's going to be if she's successful in that regard, I don't think that's going to be a good thing for the country's students.
So to take a step back, central to both of these administrations is the role of the federal government and what is the appropriate role of the federal government. And I think in addition to the emphasis that we've seen on school choice, like charter schools, vouchers, tax credit, scholarship programs. The one thing I have heard consistently from Secretary DeVos and President Trump is we want to get the government out of your schools. You've already seen an effort on Capitol Hill to get rid of two major education regulations, one that was governing teacher prep programs and one that was governing accountability regulations under the new Every Student Succeeds Act. Those are gone. You've seen President Trump create this commission to review more examples of overreach, or it's kind of unclear what's going to come of that, but we'll see. So I'd like to kind of talk to you a little bit about, obviously I would bet that you think the Obama administration overstepped its bounds a little bit, Rick. So I'd love to hear from you about why that is. And if you think this new messaging from the Trump administration is, appropriate and good.
I think the messaging is directionally good. I think it's been clumsy and awkward and misses the whole point of actually trying to empower educators to solve problems for kids. But, these are rhetorical things. Look, for me, the fundamental challenges with the Trump administration, again, are not that if Arne Duncan had stayed on as superintendent in Chicago, or even if he had been state chief in Illinois and done what he did, I think it would have worked out a lot better than it actually did for kids in schools. Because look, when we talk about the federal role, it really depends on relation to what. If we're talking about building bridges and highways, when you actually get the plans articulated, when you actually figure out where the interstate highway system is going to go, we actually have a pretty reliable body of implementation science on how do you actually lay highways in ways that they wind up doing what they're supposed to do. It tends to be largely self-executing once you've made the decisions. Part of the problem with schools and colleges and early childhood is that these are fundamentally human organizations. What makes for a good school or a good learning environment actually depends a lot on context. It depends on the kids who show up. It depends on the culture of that educational organization. It depends on the resources in the community and the particular needs that exist in that school. And when you're dealing with 50 to 60 million kids across 100,000 schools in the US, it means that you're actually looking at enormous variability. Well, the problem is that policy is an incredibly crude tool. When you write laws in Washington, you have to write them for all 50 to 60 million of those kids. That's the way law works. If you don't like it, blame Montesquieu, right? This goes back half a millennia. And so what happens is you write these large catch-all laws, and then you've got well-meaning folks in the Department of Ed who spend a year, 2 years writing lots of regulation and guidance, trying to anticipate all the way the stuff's going to play out. And then they hire consultants or do trainings for officials in state education agencies who are then responsible for explaining this to the Title I coordinator in a local education agency, who then is explaining this to the instructional team and the principals. And by the time you play this game of telephone, no matter how well intended, what you have done is created an environment in which educators feel like much of their job is about compliance and box checking. Now, I think if you go back and think about the predicates of what makes for effective schools, effective learning environments, one of the things that consistently comes through is autonomy, sense of ownership. Not necessarily a sense of I do what I want to do in my classroom, but a sense that as a school community, there is coherence, a sense of responsibility, a sense of ownership for the community. And for me, the problem with federal efforts in our system is that they fundamentally work against the things that tend to make for strong learning environments. It doesn't mean the ideas aren't good. It means the way the ideas get visited upon real schools for real kids often works out other than intended.
Carmel, the role of the federal government in the Obama administration, how did they see themselves as an agent for schools, and what does that look like now in retrospect?
Well, I think a couple things. I think, first of all, the Obama administration embraced the concept of federal role that really was embraced by the George W. Bush administration as well, that the federal government sort of first and foremost needs to serve as a protector of civil rights. I think the Bush administration and the Obama administration thought that that meant not just enforcing the civil rights laws that OCR is empowered to enforce, which we see a big reversal around that issue by the current administration, but also meant that if the federal government was going to send out funds to help at-risk students, that with those funds should come this obligation that you are not categorically underserving any group of students. And that was the genesis of No Child Left Behind. I think for the Obama administration, there was a sense that that was a continued valued role for the federal government, but we needed to counterbalance that really for the reasons Rick describes, that you need to give people at the state and local level some degree of autonomy and empowerment in terms of when schools are categorically underserving a particular group of students, the best place to determine what to do about that was not at the federal level, but at a state and local level. And I think we worked hard to get that balance better in the ESEA Flexibility Initiative. I think ESSA got that balance better, although disappointingly, it doesn't look like that balance is going to be enforced because the current secretary is basically just saying that she's going to take herself out of the equation and let states and local districts do whatever they want. But I do think that was an operating principle for the Obama administration as we approach those issues. I think there was also this operating principle that underlies Race to the Top, that from the federal level, we can't really affect systemic change in 15,000 school districts or hundreds of thousands of schools, but we could affect change at the state level, and we really saw the state chiefs as kind of our primary customers who, if we could incentivize them to put in place an infrastructure that would support autonomy at the school level, that then the investments at the school level would be more effective. We thought the way to do that, the components of the infrastructure needed to do that were the ones you see in Race to the Top in terms of state longitudinal data systems, standards, and policies around how the teaching profession was not just evaluated, but supported. If you look at Race to the Top, it wasn't just teacher evaluation, it was also what's your system for providing feedback to teachers, providing supports to help them improve. So it really was a more holistic agenda around how to treat the teaching profession than I think people appreciate, because the teacher eval attached test scores got so much of the attention because it was so controversial. So I think our theory of action was really to create sort of an ecosystem that would allow for the autonomy that Rick is describing, because I think we would agree that that autonomy is necessary, but is only going to work if you have a profession that's provided the tools they need to be successful, which we thought things like data, standards, teacher evaluation systems were part of those tools. And then I think the other kind of going into it, and I mentioned this already, is on the post-secondary level, there was just this sense that the federal government did have a role not just in access. I think prior to the Obama administration, the mantra was, well, we need to provide Pell Grants and student loans so people can pay for college. I think there was a shift in the federal role under the Obama administration, because they said we have an obligation to those students, but an equal obligation to taxpayers who are funding those systems to ensure that there's some level of quality in the institutions that that our money is being used, our taxpayer money is being used to fund. We focused on the for-profit sector for two reasons, because the abuses were categorically the most egregious, but also because there were levers in the federal law that allowed us to tackle that sector. But I think you see in Obama administration policies a recognition that the entire post-secondary sector, not just for-profit colleges, needed a higher level of transparency around outcomes and protection for students and taxpayers. So I think that was sort of how on each of those issues, how the sort of operating principle in terms of the federal role. I think under the new administration, you see again like a complete reversal of that perspective. And I don't think that's a good thing, that we're basically going to send out taxpayer dollars to institutions, whether it's at the K-12 or higher ed level, and abandon this concept that the government does have a right to protect people from exploitation, protect people from civil rights violations, and ensure that the money is being used in a way that doesn't categorically leave particular groups of students behind. I think the good news is that a lot of I think in large part due to the work of the Bush administration, I don't think overnight we're going to move away from this concept that all children can learn and that we need to look at disaggregated data. I think that's a legacy that really is attributable to the Bush administration that isn't going to be abandoned, that most states will continue to focus on that in districts and schools. But I do think there needs to be a backstop to make sure that that happens.
And just one second, I realized that I didn't actually. The Trump folks have certainly not articulated a specific vision of what the federal role is. So let me just, and I didn't either before. So one, I think Carmel's exactly right. I think many of us talk about kind of this Bush-Obama legacy. To my mind, Obama took a door that the Bush folks had pushed open and swung it way open. But I think there is a real continuity there. From where I stand, look, the federal government absolutely has some unique roles that it can and should play. One is that federal government ought to be in the transparency business. There's a reason that Article 1 of the Constitution talks about weights and measures. It's a real problem for interstate commerce if a foot is 6 inches in North Carolina and 12 inches in South Carolina. Now, when it comes to education, of course, the question is comparability then gets you into questions of what's being assessed, and that gets you into questions of dictating curriculum. So there's a balance here. But for me, for instance, the transparency framework of NCLB, those 17 tests, grades 3 to 8 reading and math, science, elementary, that is a useful and appropriate federal framework because it ensures that parents, communities can actually make these comparisons state to state. And I think further, the requirements that states disaggregate in similar ways, as Carmel pointed out, is a powerful lever for making sure that if we're going to invest, say, Title I dollars, that these are reasonable asks. Second thing that I think is appropriate for the federal government is obviously research. Research is a public good. There's a reason why we spend $35 billion a year through the NIH. That when you actually do bench science and learn things, it becomes available to everybody. Districts or states or private providers are going to massively underinvest on their own in terms of what we want. Third thing that actually is a completely appropriate federal role, as Carmel mentioned, is the enforcement of civil rights. This is a constitutional obligation. This, of course, does get us into the question of what does it mean to enforce civil rights? And when does federal enforcement overstep in ways that are unproductive? But I don't think I don't know anybody who would argue with Carmel's point that the feds should be in that enforcement business. And fourth, there's actually a bankruptcy function that is always lodged in national governments. If you are a school board and you come to power in a district, one of the frustrations, for instance, is about a third of the nation's contracts and about a third of state laws have evergreen provisions. These are in an effort to balance, since public unions are restricted in their ability to strike. The idea is contract language never goes away even when the contract expires. This can create huge problems because it means even well-intended popular school boards or mayors face real constraints in their ability to revisit things that might have made sense in 1975 or 1995, but don't make sense today. Same problem crops up with vendor agreements. So getting seriously about some kind of bankruptcy capacity so that states and districts can go in and revisit things which no longer make sense is an important and appropriate federal role.
So I'd like to start taking questions from you guys soon. So start thinking about things you'd like to ask these guys. I can ask them questions all day. I'll probably ask them questions after this session is over. But I want to get to the topic du jour. School choice is what we hear about from the Trump administration all the time. In some cases, there's really been a singular focus on school choice, and it's gotten them in trouble, like we saw earlier this year with the statement Secretary DeVos made about historically black colleges and universities, tying that to pioneers of school choice. So what we've seen from them so far, obviously on the campaign trail, President Trump proposed this $20 billion idea that we have not seen yet, but we have seen some of their priorities in the budget, which was leaked yesterday. Obviously, there's more money there for charter schools. There's more money there for private school initiatives. And we've also seen this focus and discussion around the notion of a possible federal tax credit idea. That hasn't really come to fruition yet. It's possible, I have a story out today actually that talks about how Secretary DeVos is going to be speaking at a conference on Monday, and she's expected to possibly, talk about that on a high level at the very least. So we might see more information from them on that. But the Obama administration was also focused on choice, was supportive of charter schools and reform efforts like that. So Carmel, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about how, what role school choice played during the Obama administration. I think we obviously saw this aversion to private school investments as opposed to high quality public school investments. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I mean, what role did school choice play?
Well, I think the president and the secretary believe pretty strongly that providing parents with options in the public system was a really good thing to do. Arnie really promoted choice in Chicago and worked closely with charter operators to expand choices in Chicago, as well as implementing innovative programs in the traditional public schools in Chicago. So I think, and at CAP, we're also a supporter of public school choice and the supporter of high-quality charter schools, and think some of the high-quality charter management organizations across the country are doing some of the most innovative things in education to very positive impact. But I think there's a very strong case to be made for setting a line at public options versus private options. I think over and over again you see private school voucher programs that, first of all, the research doesn't bear out that they provide significantly better performance and often less good performance than the public systems they're in. There's also just a tremendous opportunity for children getting left behind in a voucher program where I don't think the market functions well enough to protect them from voucher programs being used to fund the education of children like mine who don't really need additional resources and leave behind children who don't have advocates to help them get to good programs. We also did a report recently at CAP showing that in many communities there just aren't a lot of private school options, so it's not really it's not something that, in terms of a national initiative, that's going to result in dramatic change for many students. So I think that it's the wrong direction to move money from the public system to particularly for-profit charters and private schools, and particularly where that money is being taken away from the public system, which is what the Trump administration has proposed.
So Rick, what do you think about this new emphasis on allowing families to access any school they want to send their children to? I mean, that's one thing that Secretary DeVos has talked about over and over again, was I was able to send my children to private school, and every family should have that right. So what do you think about this new focus? And if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, the research on vouchers as well. I've been looped into many a Twitter argument about that in the last few months. So I'd love to hear from you about, a little bit about that discussion.
Sure. In principle, I am with DeVos on this. I think more choices are good things for families. I think anybody who suggests that private school choice or charters or anything else is some kind of fix for American education is nutty. I don't think school choice is a fix. I do think its real power is that, as I mentioned before, for me, I think one of the truisms is that effective schools are defined by a clear sense of mission, by an instructional coherence, by the fact that faculty want to be there, that families want to be there, that families and teachers feel like they're on the same page. And I think that's much easier to create in choice-based educational communities. So I think that's the real power. And to Carmel's point about the dispersion of private schools, that's exactly right. And another part of the promise of school choice for me is, what are we seeing in terms of the emergence of new good schools and not just reshuffling kids? And to the extent that we have seen school choice plans that have not done a lot to foster that kind of creation, that raises a real question about kind of these ecosystem issues that Carmel pointed to. And that, I think, deserves a lot more attention and thought than it's received. So for me, choice, like accountability, is useful as an enabling condition. Done thoughtfully through policy, it creates environments where people who actually do the work are in a more advantageous position to deliver good schools to kids. But it's not a solution. I'm not sure why, I'm not enthused about the federal government getting actively involved in supporting it in the way we're talking about, partly because the same critiques I just made about some of the Obama-era efforts, I think play out here, that good school choice programs have to be thoughtful about community context, the way they're designed. They're not useful in all communities. I don't think they're especially useful in Montana, for instance. But it's also the case that Trump is poisonous brand. This craziest thing to me in the world is that school choice advocates who've spent 27 years going back to the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, getting approved in Wisconsin, working diligently in states with bipartisan communities, where, different states, different coalitions and the rest, but they have strong anchors in states that have signed on to this stuff. The idea that you would want to have Donald Trump, the least popular and most polarizing president in the history of polling, become the de facto pitchman for an idea like this just strikes me as strange. I think the research on school choice, a great, really accessible summary of this was done by Harvard's own Marty West a year or two ago for Education Next. Pat Wolf at the University of Arkansas, I think, has also done remarkable work on this. I would disagree, I think, substantially with Carmel's read of the evidence. I would argue that the vast preponderance of randomized controlled trial experiments on choice show positive effects for participants, certainly positive effects in terms of whether the families like the school, and generally modestly positive effects on the outcomes that we care about, high school completion, college matriculation, reading and math scores. Never all of those, usually one or two. But I would also suggest, and it's also the case that some of the more recent evidence on school choice, certainly out of the Louisiana statewide program, draft work out of the Indiana program, and the most recent one-year eval in the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, find negative results, which I think also speaks to the larger question that, look, school choice is not an intervention. It is not a drug therapy. The fact that you find these positive results in 12 or 15 years of RCTs does not mean school choice works. What it means is that when you give families choice in Dayton, in Milwaukee, in New York City, in Washington, D.C., that allows them to get out of really dysfunctional neighborhood schools and allows them to move their children into under-enrolled Catholic schools, that those kids generally benefit. I find that wholly plausible. It makes a lot of sense. That doesn't mean that when you go ahead and take those same choice policies into entirely new environments with new dynamics and contexts, that you will necessarily see the same results, good or bad. For me, part of the problem here is we are talking about broad gauge research on vaguely articulated policies as if they were much more specific FDA beta trial, gold standard. And they're simply fundamentally different, and I think how we would be well advised to use them.
Do you have further thoughts on the research on vouchers, or?
No, I think Rick did a fair job summarizing it.
Okay, well, great. I would love to take questions from you guys at this point. We have a good amount of time left for them, so anybody want to start us off?
And there are 2 microphones here, so please walk on up to a mic if you have a question. You'll be our first. Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I appreciate the discussion. I just had a follow-up about the choice. My name is Brandon McKelvey. I work in Orange County Public Schools in Florida, and it was a really surprising event to see our House Speaker in Florida. Florida has been, again, in the front of choice and accountability for a very long period of time, say there's other things that schools do besides test scores, and that choice is a valuable thing in and of itself. How much is this disagreement or kind of maybe lack of consensus now that we have about choice and accountability is that choice is now seen an end rather than a means to an end of kind of improving test scores, helping with achievement gaps and other types of pieces? We've started to see that a lot, and I just wondered what you both thought about that.
I always say that reading and math scores pick up about 30 to 35% of what I care about in a K-12 education. 20 years ago, when I thought that way, I thought we were paying way less than 30 to 35% attention to these scores. And so it seemed to me at the time like NCLB, while crudely drawn and exaggerated, seemed like a corrective step in the right direction. Today, I think for lots of parents and educators, it feels like we are treating reading and math scores as vastly more determinant than they actually are for the things that they care about in schools. A problem was, for folks who were saying this stuff, I've been saying this at least since, I don't know, 09, 10, I've been writing about it at length. When we said it then, there was a pretty broad kind of bipartisan educational consensus that, look, we have to treat reading and math scores as useful proxies in order for a lot of this other stuff to really get traction. In order for teacher evaluation systems to be objectively defensible, in order to make the case for the Common Core. And what's happened is, I think, especially as you've seen this fracturing of the school reform kind of coalition, which I think, again, partly is because some of these individual policies have become so poisoned in the public mind, partly because I think getting Washington involved created huge second thoughts on many folks on the right. Suddenly, this question of how much emphasis we ought to put on reading and math scores just got opened up for relitigating. And the funny thing is, when you look, as you know, at parental surveys on this, Pat Wolf and Tom Stewart's terrific work on DC Opportunity Scholarship, for instance, other state surveys, when you ask parents about the criteria they look for in choosing their school, and this goes back to the Rand evaluations of Alum Rock back in the early 70s, test scores are never in your top half dozen or 8 things. Partly it's because parents are so much closer to the school that they wind up looking at things like, do they think the principal is a strong leader? Do the teachers seem competent? Does the school care about their kids? Is the school safe? Now, we look at test scores when we buy homes, but that's because we're too far removed from actually forming these incremental judgments based on these human dimensions. So what's happened, as this stuff has been opened up for relitigation, folks who are strong choice advocates are saying, look, we want to stop having to argue for choice just as an instrumentality. We want to argue for school choice because we believe in it as a moral principle. And that has become a real point of cleavage between folks who are kind of full spectrum choice enthusiasts and kind of reform-minded Democrats who see choice as one tool as part of a larger kind of reform agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I would say that I don't see choice as a tool for improving test scores, but I think that there's value, other benefits of giving parents and students options in terms of the programs at the schools offered in their community. So that is why I think having public school choice is a good thing. I think if you look at school districts like Denver, where they've really tried to eliminate the distinction between their charter schools and their traditional public schools, it's all part of kind of a unified system of choice that just gives students and teachers options. I think that should be the objective in the public school choice context. I didn't say earlier that another major concern I have about expanding to vouchers is the voucher programs we've had to date don't extend the same kind of civil rights protections that exist in the public system. So I think that's the other major factor to draw the line between public school choice and private choice. I'd also say that I think there is still, there's bipartisan support for public school choice. I think at the extremes of both parties, there's fracturing, but I don't know that there's this massive partisan fracture around public school choice. I think the fracture exists in diverting public dollars to private schools, and that's really where the debate is being driven. But I don't think, in part for the reasons Rick described, I don't see Republicans lining up behind DeVos and Trump on that. Some will, but I think many members of Congress realize that people don't see private school vouchers as the solution to improving our education system. In terms of test scores, I think, I personally think we should use test scores as a way to identify where there's, again, systemic extreme problems, that we should be looking at test scores to see where a particular group of students is just, in a particular school, is year after year the system is failing them. That was sort of the driving force behind our ESCA flexibility initiative. We got a lot of pushback from the reform community that we weren't using test scores enough, but our theory of action in ESCA flexibility, and I think this was carried through in ESSA, was, you should use test scores to really get at the extreme. So if you have a school that over multiple years is at the bottom of the performance spectrum for that state in English language arts or math, you need to take dramatic action in that school. You need to call a spade. You have to label it as a failing school because it is labeling. It is failing. Likewise, the Congress didn't take up our other aspect of our accountability vision in doing the same thing on the positive side. Identify schools that over multiple years were having high levels of growth, not high levels of proficiency, but growth, and rewarding those schools and highlighting them as successful. And then in the middle, what you need to do is, as Rick mentioned, use the data that parents use when they're evaluating their school. Have a dashboard of data that tells them, do they have high turnover of teachers? Do they have high levels of absenteeism? So those kinds of other data elements that are important to parents and should be important to policymakers as well, that should be available, and that's where your work really comes in, is that needs to be available in consumable format for teachers. Teachers, parents, students, I think a lot of states under the Flexibility Initiative pivoted to grading systems, A through F grading systems. I actually am not a big fan of those because I think it, again, tries to summarize a school across the performance spectrum in a way that's impossible. So I'm a big advocate for pursuing what I think we laid out in the Flexibility Initiative. Use those concrete data elements of test scores and graduation rates to see where you have huge aberrational performance, whether that's at the school level or the subgroup level, and act on it. And in the middle, use a broader array of data to figure out how to create continuous improvement. And if the school's in the middle, help them get to the top and create rewards for getting to the top. And if they're slipping down, taking action.
Okay, other questions? Yeah, over here.
Hello, I'm Stephen Fedor, Tulsa Public Schools. I came in just a minute late, so if you've addressed this, please say we addressed that and I'll go sit down. But with the focus on immigration in particular is what I'm thinking about, but I think there's larger pieces. We saw in New York City a school turn away an ICE official in alignment with their policy as a district. In Tulsa, or actually Oklahoma as a state, there was a recommendation from the legislature to save money to identify English language learners, identify if they're citizens, and then potentially deport them. And a strategy or a thought that came out of that was to purge the local systems of ELL data to make sure that they couldn't have access to that in a direct way. So my question is, what's the role, if any, of a district or school site in protecting students and changing their philosophy around sanctuaries for individuals?
Carmel, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the ways that the legacy of the Trump and DeVos administration is going to be really, really negative, because you do see them inspiring those kind of local actions and really inspiring for people who talk about local control. What they're trying to do in terms of sanctuary cities really goes to the heart of operating against local control. I think that the Supreme Court has found that school systems have an obligation to serve English language learners and not to refuse to serve them based on their immigration status. That is Supreme Court precedent. And there is an obligation not just at the local level, but at the federal level. This is one of the obligations that Betsy DeVos has, and she should be doing the opposite of what she's doing, and she should be aggressively using OCR to make sure that districts and schools are not shrinking. Her job is not to enforce the immigration laws of the United States. Her job is to ensure that the civil rights of the students in America are protected, and this is a fundamental right that the Supreme Court has recognized. So hearing stories like that just really hurts my heart very deeply. I don't think it is in the nation's interest for us to not serve immigrant students regardless of their status in terms of being documented or undocumented. So, I hope more and more jurisdictions continue to exercise courage, like the courage that was exercised in New York City. I went to graduate school in Texas, and I was just there last weekend, and it seems the Trump administration has emboldened the state legislature there to preempt local policies around around sanctuary city policies. So I think it's a really dangerous and unhappy turn of events.
Rick, what do you make of all of it?
I believe Carmel's absolutely right that the Supreme Court has, right now, not just English language learners, I mean that all school-age children in the U.S. The court has ruled there's an obligation to serve them, regardless of immigration status. And so school systems absolutely ought to do that. Same time, I mean, I am just struck that in education circles, how uninterested and tone deaf we are that nations have borders. And there are rules for entering a nation. And resources spent on people who are in a nation illegally are resources that are not being spent on children and families who are legal residents or citizens of the U.S. And so it seems to me that it should be a complicated and fraught thing. I don't understand the ease and the panache with which so many in education say, well, we're here for the kids. I mean, you're also, the people in education, like in any other public entity, their tax dollars are paid, their salaries are paid by tax dollars, paid by mostly legal residents and citizens. These dollars are paid to provide services, but it seems to me that I'd like to think that public entities are generally inclined to be cooperative in the enforcement of the nation's laws. That seems like a reasonable ask. So that's a tension there. I respect that. I expect schools and school systems to make a priority of trying to make their students comfortable and recognizing that they have an obligation, a moral and legal obligation to serve those students. But I'd like to think educators also feel a moral and legal obligation to help and see that the laws of the land are enforced and applied. And it just strikes me that an appreciation for that tension sometimes seems missing when I've heard us talking about this in education circles.
Another question over here.
Very much. This will be our last question. Thank you.
All right. So Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to establish the military for the country. And the very first federal policy initiative in the education sector was, in fact, military-driven, the Impact Aid Act in 1955. So how is it in the best interest of the federal government to reduce their footprint in education when it is a critical part of our national security interests to have people coming of military age that are highly educated and capable of learning skills required to defend the country if necessary, and if that's the path that they choose to take?
Rick, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I mean,
I think that was intended for Rick.
yeah. I don't know. I mean,
I want to increase the footprint.
By that logic, right? I mean, if you want to use Article 1, Section 8, by that logic, the government ought to have all kinds of dictates. I think there's also an argument that children are more likely to be prepared for military service if they're raised in two-parent households. So that logic would dictate that the federal government ought to be able to prohibit adoption by single-parent families. It would seem to me that children are better fit for military service if they are healthy and not overweight. So by that logic, the federal government ought to be empowered to swoop in and confiscate Cheetos in any family where children don't make their weight at monthly weigh-ins at school. We live in a nation which is built on the premise that we have, that there are substantial spheres of negative liberty articulated in the Bill of Rights and elsewhere that attach to us as people. The 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution were specifically written to try to reserve to states and communities authority over things that are important to them. And much of American history, at different points in history, we've decided that there is one macro narrative. Frequently, when we talk about it now, we've decided that the macro narrative of American history is race and everything else is peripheral. I don't think that's right. I think race is one important thread in the American narrative. Another has always been this tension between the central government and state and community government and all of the different ways that reflects different visions and beliefs of what it means to be members of a national community. And the fact that, National Defense Education Act or at various other points, we have struck certain balances in Washington doesn't necessarily, to my mind, imply any specific answers about, I don't know that they were right when they did that in the 50s. I don't know if they're wrong. What I'm interested in is what do I think is the most constructive and useful way to think about how do we solve problems for kids and communities today and going forward. And, what I've shared is kind of my best take on it.
Just to follow up on that, I think I would say that I spend a lot of my time these days, because I work on policy across issues, not just education at CAP, and I spend a lot of my time these days thinking about economic policy and also work on national security policy. And I think if you think about the pressures on Americans in the economy in terms of what it's going to take in the future to be able to keep our economy strong, but to be able to ensure that people have good jobs that will support their families. That given the pressures of globalization and automation, I just think there's a very strong case to be made that it is a national imperative, not just from a national security standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, for us to dramatically up our game in terms of the education systems in America. I think, I think one of the problems one of the reasons we're having so much backlash politically, I would argue, to some of the reforms in education is because there has been this, slow and gradual embrace of that concept, first through No Child Left Behind. It was all children, not just, in 50 years ago, if you educated the top 10% of the graduating class from high school for college, that was enough because there were lots of really good, high-paying, family-sustaining jobs with just a high school diploma. There was a recognition in No Child Left Behind that we had to go deeper, that we had to assume that all children could live to high standards. And I think that we just get more and more evidence that that was the right way to go in terms of the goal for the system. And we upped the expectations for children, and we, at the same time, upped the expectations for school systems and, most importantly, teachers. But then we didn't really change the way we recruited, trained, advanced, supported, paid teachers. So at CAP, one of our biggest focuses moving forward, not just at the national level, but the state and local level, is to try to garner, as a national campaign, the idea that we have to think very differently about the teaching profession because we're asking so much more of them. 50 years ago, they only had to get 10% of their class to college. 50 years ago, it was accepted that if they had a student with disabilities, they could send them off someplace else. Now they have to teach them in the least restrictive environment. Those are all good developments. They're not bad developments. They're necessary developments from a national security economic policy perspective. But we can't up the expectations and then not change how we operate. So I think that all argues for a national imperative to really engage with in supporting and rethinking how the education sector is operating. So it's not a constitutional argument. I guess it's really a political argument that if we're going to survive in terms of the global economy, in terms of giving our military the talent that they need, we really do at every level of government, including the federal level, we have to really, really engage very deeply in public education, not private education. So I hope we'll come back to that when at the presidential level and a future political cycle, but in the meantime, I think we have to really keep our eye on that goal with the Congress that we have and with state and local leadership.
Well, this has been wonderful, a really good discussion in what has become a very unique political moment. So if you could all just give Carmel and Rick a hand. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks, Carmel. Yeah, thank you.